In Mexico's state of Michoacán in the early 2010s, the government had effectively surrendered. The Knights Templar cartel ruled here. They extorted everyone: lime plantation owners, doctors, merchants. Refused to pay, and the price was torture and death. The police either worked for them or were dead. In 2011, at La Jolla Ranch, authorities discovered 47 mass graves, 193 bodies. It was the work of the Templarios. They stopped buses and gave men a choice: fight to the death with sledgehammers so the winner could join the cartel or be executed. The world was shaken, but in Michoacán, this was daily life. In that hell lived Dr. José Manuel Mireles, a respected physician from the town of La Huacana. For years he treated his neighbors and watched pickup trucks full of heavily armed narco gunmen cruise the streets. He watched entire families vanish. In February 2013, his patients finally snapped. Mireles, a man in glasses who looked more like a professor than a rebel, gathered people like him: farmers, shopkeepers, drivers. They called themselves the Autodefensas, the self-defense forces. Their slogan was simple: if the police won't protect the people will protect themselves. Armed with hunting rifles and old pistols, they began patrolling the streets of their town, Tepalcatepec. And then something unbelievable happened. Where the regular army had suffered defeat, these civilians pushed the cartel out. People welcomed them like liberators, bringing them water and food. The movement grew like a snowball, spreading to neighboring towns. New leaders joined in: the charismatic Estanislao Papapito Beltran and the ambitious Luis Antonio El Americano Torres. But even at the very heart of this light, darkness was already taking root. To win, they needed modern weapons, and those weapons were supplied to the militias by another powerful cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Their goal was simple: use the Autodefensas as a hammer to smash their enemies, the Templarios. Dr. Mireles' naive idealism collided with the brutal reality of a war where every kind of help comes with a price. While Mireles believed in the purity of the fight, his movement was quietly turning into a pawn in a game that wasn't his, and the outcome of that game would be bloody. The first weeks of the Autodefensas felt like a strange, jittery carnival. At roadblocks built from old trucks and coils of barbed wire, it wasn't soldiers standing guard. It was bakers, teachers, and teenagers. Their weapons inspired more pity than fear: rusty shotguns, hunting rifles, pistols left over from their grandfather's time. They patrolled the streets of Tepalcatepec like people who could barely believe what they were doing. Their strength wasn't in bullets, but in one thing: they had stopped being afraid. The very fact that they existed was a challenge, but the carnival ended fast. The first clashes came, and with them came the realization that a hunting rifle is useless against the Templarios' machine guns. The movement needed real weapons: body armor, radios, communications. And that's when different people stepped onto the stage: shadows who'd stood in the back during meetings, men in brand new cowboy boots and expensive watches, who spoke little but promised a lot. They opened supply channels. A week later, new AK-47s, RPG-2 launchers, and body armor showed up at the checkpoints. The question, where did this come from, hung in the air, but saying it out loud became dangerous. Everyone knew the answer: the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The Templarios' deadly enemy was happy to arm anyone who hit their competition. With those weapons came a new, hard hierarchy. The squads weren't led by respected community figures anymore, but by the ones who knew how to use the hardware. Luis Antonio Torres, El Americano, stepped out of the shadows. His men, now in camouflage with close-cropped hair, they moved fast and they moved brutally. Dr. Mireles, still walking around in his famous white shirt, talked about justice and legality. El Americano spoke the language of tactics and territory. Their goals split. Mireles wanted to return the monopoly on violence to the state. Americano wanted to create his own. The success was both stunning and terrifying. By April 2013, the Autodefensas controlled not just one town, but a full dozen municipalities. They were greeted with flowers and tears of gratitude. But behind every liberated city, came a strange ritual. Within days, unknown advisors would arrive. They helped set up local security, but in reality, they installed their own rules. On the walls next to Viva las Autodefensas, a new, barely noticeable graffiti began to appear. A spider, the emblem of CJNG. Mireles saw it. He tried to protest, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of this new reality. His authority was moral. The real power now belonged to whoever held more guns. The movement split into two camps: idealists who believed in a clean people's revolution, and pragmatists, or cynics, who understood that this war was just one episode in a much larger struggle between cartels. Trust melted away by the day. The climax was the operation to take Apatzingan, the region's second-largest city and a Templario stronghold. The assault was led by El Americano. This wasn't a burst of popular rage, it was a disciplined military operation. The city fell in a single day, and when Dr. Mireles drove into the main square to speak to the cheering crowd, he saw that the key buildings were already occupied by men in camouflage, faces he didn't recognize. His victory smelled like someone else's sweat and gunpowder. He had won, but this land was no longer his. That evening, at his first real command post, Mireles found a crumpled note on the table. Anonymous. Just one line. "He who pays for the music calls the tune." He balled it up, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He understood. He had let the genie out of the bottle. And now that genie, powerful and ruthless, was dancing around him, and the doctor could no longer tell where the dance of liberation ended and the dance of conquest began. The climb to the peak of glory was over. Ahead, there was only the abyss. By the end of 2013, the Autodefensas had become a real force, controlling 36 municipalities across Michoacán. Their triumphant finale was supposed to be the takeover of Morelia, the state capital. On January 12, 2014, columns of pickup trucks carrying armed men in camouflage rolled into the city with almost no resistance. It was a PR move, a show of strength aimed not so much at the cartel as at the federal government, which had spent months pretending there wasn't a civil war unfolding right under its nose. As Dr. Mireles drove past the historic cathedral, he could feel the dizzy rush of success. He was on top, but the summit was unstable. It was right then that every internal contradiction came to the surface. While Mireles posed for photographers, his top military commander, Hype, was holding secret talks, not with the government, but with Servando Gomez Martinez himself, La Tuta, the supreme leader of the Knights Templar. Mireles only learned about the meeting after the fact, and it shook the movement to its core. Why would a militia commander sit down with the monster they had all risen up against? The explanation was cynical and simple: to avoid unnecessary losses. But the real reason was money and spheres of influence. It became clear that some autodefensas had already cut deals with the enemy, dividing territory and businesses. Ideals died the moment they collided with reality. That betrayal split the movement into three warring camps. First, Mireles' inner circle, still trying to talk about legality and restoring order. Second, the pragmatists led by El Americano and Hype, for whom the war was a business project, and the alliance with CJNG was a profitable arrangement. And third, the most radical field commanders, men like Hipólito Mora, who saw any negotiations with cartels or the government as sacrilege and demanded a war to the bitter end. In this chaos, the federal government finally decided to intervene. It saw the autodefensas as a bigger threat than the cartels themselves. Cartels were criminals. You could cut deals with criminals. But an armed population that no longer recognized the state? That was revolution. In Mexico City, officials crafted a clever plan, not to destroy the movement, but to co-opt it, to legalize it, decapitate it, and dissolve it into state structures. In May 2014, negotiations began. The government offered a deal. The autodefensas would turn in heavy weapons, their leaders would receive official roles in a new rural police, and rank-and-file fighters would be absorbed into its ranks. On paper, it looked like a reasonable compromise. In reality, it was a trap. Mireles, exhausted by the war and still believing in institutions, agreed. For him, it was a chance to turn a grassroots movement into a legitimate force. For El Americano, it was a way to legalize his control over territory. For radicals like Mora, it was an unacceptable surrender. In exchange for legalization, the government demanded they restore order inside the movement, meaning hand over the provocateurs and criminals. Under those labels, authorities meant the most principled commanders, the ones they couldn't control. A quiet hunt began. That same spring of 2014, federal forces arrested Hipólito Mora on a flimsy pretext, accusing him of murder. It was a clear message to everyone. Legalization wasn't amnesty. It was a snare that could tighten selectively. Mora, a hero of the early days, ended up in prison, while El Americano, whose ties to CJNG were no secret, kept riding freely in his armored pickup. The movement that began as an act of desperation was now dying from betrayal, cynicism, and government intrigue. The peak had passed. The collapse was beginning. The government's plan worked perfectly. The movement was legalized, fractured, and weakened. Now it was time to cut off its head. On June 27, 2014, federal forces arrested Dr. José Manuel Mireles and Estanislao Papapito Beltran at a ranch without a single shot fired. The official reason was possession of firearms not permitted under the legalization agreement, assault rifles, grenade launchers. The real reason was political. Mireles, with his massive popular support, had become unpredictable. In prison, he was safe, at least for the state. The arrest of the leaders sent a message to everyone. Luis Antonio El Americano Torres, whose unit had refused to disarm back during the legalization phase, understood the game had been exposed. He didn't wait for his turn. Instead, he openly moved his fighters under the banner of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. His rural police instantly became an armed wing of a drug cartel. The territories the Autodefensas had taken from the Templarios now shifted under CJNG control. The bloody circle closed. The outcome was tragic and predictable. A movement born to fight lawlessness was destroyed by the very state it had tried to force into action. Some of its fighters became ordinary mercenaries for a new cartel. Others went home, disillusioned and intimidated. The Knights Templar cartel was crushed, but a stronger, more ruthless organization took its place. Michoacán didn't find peace. It simply changed owners. A parallel story was unfolding in the north. While Michoacán was in civil war, in Arizona, U.S. veteran Tim Nile Foley created Arizona Border Recon. His group, made up of former military personnel and civilian activists, patrolled the border, detaining undocumented migrants and uncovering drug stash sites. Their methods were controversial, but against the backdrop of chaos in Mexico, their actions looked like a model of order. They were a response by desperate citizens to a different kind of state failure, the inability to control the border. The contrast between the two stories was striking. In one case, self-defense rotted into a new link in organized crime. In the other, it remained a fringe but structured act of civil disobedience. By 2015, the landscape in Michoacán had changed. The white Autodefensas t-shirts were gone. In their place came new symbols. On walls, at checkpoints, and even on the uniform patches of the rural police, the most common mark now was a spider, the emblem of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The takeover was complete. Luis Antonio El Americano Torres didn't just join the cartel, he became one of its key regional commanders, a duke on newly conquered ground. His units, now well-equipped and tightly organized, provided security for drug shipments, controlled ports, and kept crushing whatever competitors were still left. The cartel operated like an efficient corporation. Where the Templarios relied on blind terror, CJNG imposed a system. They introduced fixed, almost official tribute rates on local businesses, which, for many farmers, was actually preferable to the arbitrary abuse of the previous rulers. The cartel took control of the state's key industries, especially exports of avocados, limes, and iron ore. This was no longer just gang rule. It was criminal hegemony, deeply embedded in the economy. The fates of the movement's founders diverged. Hipólito Mora, arrested after a clash with Torres's men, spent several years in prison. Dr. José Manuel Mireles was released in 2015 after many of the charges against him fell apart. He returned to La Huacana, but no longer as a leader. He lived under constant threat, receiving messages from CJNG, which saw him as a potential symbol of resistance. His health, damaged by prison and stress, kept declining. He died from COVID-19 complications in November 2020. His funeral was modest with no state honors. The authorities preferred to forget the man who did what they could not. Meanwhile, the war evolved. After defeating the Templarios, CJNG ran into a new coalition, the United Cartels, Carteles Unidos, made up of remnants of older groups, including some former Autodefensas. The conflict became even more brutal and more complicated for ordinary people, now squeezed between two powerful forces. Fighting shifted into rural, mountainous areas, but its consequences, bodies left in the streets and new mass graves, kept surfacing in towns on a regular basis. The state, after restoring control on paper through legalization, in reality outsourced security to the cartel. Local authorities and police were forced to cooperate with CJNG just to maintain some illusion of order. Villages that once greeted militiamen with flowers now silently paid taxes to El Americano's people. The dream of self-rule and safety finally shattered against a reality where the only functioning vertical of power was criminal. There was no liberation. There was consolidation. Power concentrated in the hands of a new organization, more pragmatic and more ruthless than the last. The final takeaway is this. By trying to burn out the tumor of one cartel, Dr. Mireles unintentionally helped create a new cancer cell, more aggressive, more intelligent. His movement wasn't a cure, it was a mutagen. It proved that when the state is dysfunctional and the economy is soaked in narco dollars, any force, even one born from righteous anger, inevitably gets pulled into the orbit of that black market. Drug money is gravity. It bends every attempt at resistance. The government truly doesn't care how ordinary people feel, because those feelings don't convert into the currency used to buy elite loyalty or bankroll election campaigns. Narco money does. That's why the fight against cartels stopped being a war for citizens' well-being a long time ago. It became a war for control of cash flows and spheres of influence. Mireles and his people became bargaining chips in that larger game, where their sincere demand for justice was used to swap out who sat at the top of the criminal business. If you want to support this new channel, the donation link is in the channel description.